Good afternoon, everyone. Hola. Can you all hear me? Everyone can hear me? Okay. It was like, hola, privyet, which is about the extent of my Russian. So David is giving me the thumbs up here. In honor of our honoree today, I will use my elementary Russian at any opportunity I have today. My name is Jelani Cobb, and I'm the Dean of Columbia Journalism School. Still getting accustomed to saying that. Welcome to the John Chancellor Award ceremony. As I've said more than a few times this fall, it really is wonderful to have everyone here, to be able to see each other in person and not pixelated in little digital squares. And so we don't take this lightly, and we are very happy to have everyone here. This award honors the legacy of one of the great broadcast journalists, John Chancellor. It was established in 1995 by Ira Lipman, a great friend and generous supporter of journalism and a great friend of mine personally. When people ask me how I got here to Columbia, my standard, almost dad joke response is that I took the one train, made a right, campus was right there. But in reality, Ira Lipman was central to how it is that I came to be at Columbia, and his foresight and his creation of the Ira A. Lipman Professorship, which I was fortunate to hold before becoming Dean. He passed away in 2019, and he is dearly missed. And now I would like to welcome our honoree in particular, Masha Gessen, who is many things: author, journalist, activist, staff writer. The first version of this was to open with welcome everyone to the New Yorker staff meeting. There really are quite a few of us here. Just as a kind of pointing to the obvious, I'm the dean, I'm a staff writer at the New Yorker. My predecessor, Steve Cole, was the dean and staff writer at the New Yorker. His predecessor, Nick Lemon, dean, staff writer at the New Yorker. And so we've said that David Remnick could open a really kind of shady consulting business. Like, if you're ever interested in becoming the dean of Columbia Journalism School. So we're really proud of Masha, and for me, on the Chancellor Awards board, it typically, I look forward to it because it typically involves, when we get applications and portfolios, it involves me learning more about the work of journalists that I may be somewhat familiar with or who I've heard of but haven't seen much of their work, and sometimes journalists who I don't know anything about at all. And over the course of reading all the entries, it really is a kind of wonderful education. In this instance, it's a little bit different because we are honoring someone whose work I'm deeply familiar with and have admired for a really long time. And I think it's fair to say that the arc of Masha's work has gone from important to indispensable. And I think that we are really, really, I think that we always do, we're always proud of each year when we have our honorees. And I'm really, really particularly happy to see us honoring Masha today. So welcome and congratulations. Welcome also to all of your friends, family, colleagues who are here to mark your accomplishments, including your brother Keith, who is a professor and colleague here at the journalism schools. Keith, right here. To state the obvious, as I've said, this is a bit of a work-family reunion for all of the New Yorker people here. And we're really fortunate to have a lineup of friends and colleagues here who are friends and colleagues who are here to pay tribute to you in your career. Before we get started, I'd like to welcome some other special guests. We have two of our most recent honorees with us today who we celebrated virtually. because of the pandemic. So welcome to Columbia and congratulations to Don McNeil Jr. and to Tony Bartlemy. As always, I'd like to thank the prizes department for putting this event together. That's Abby Wright and Lisa Cohen. Oh, there she is, back there. And thank you to my colleagues on the Chancellor Award Selection Committee for sharing your insight and values as members of that committee. And I'll just say the meetings are very engaging and substantive. You know, we did not have any fistfights this year, which was an improvement over previous times. I'm kidding though, but we really have a very collegial and deeply engaged committee, and it's always wonderful to work with you all each year. We also would like to welcome John Chancellor's daughter Mary, who was also a member of the committee, and her son Michael, who are here with us right here. And we're fortunate to have with us Ira Lippman's three sons, Ben, Gus, and Josh Lippman. When Ira brought the Chancellor Award to Columbia in 2005, he had the foresight to create the John Chancellor Scholarship at Columbia. Since then, more than 16 students with outstanding academic achievements and leadership qualities, and the leadership qualities of John Chancellor have received the scholarship. This year's Chancellor Scholar is a student in our full-time MS program, Thomas Copeland. Thomas is from Belfast in Northern Ireland. Throughout his undergraduate degree at Queen's University, Thomas worked in television production on BBC Current Affairs live programming and as a freelance journalist for Sky News and BBC Radio 5 Live. As head of news at Queen's University Radio, he has won student journalism awards across the UK and Ireland. Welcome to Thomas, who I'm told is out covering a hearing for his master's thesis, but will be joining us soon, which is like perfect. And now let's take a moment to remember John Chancellor in this short video profiling John Chancellor's life as a reporter and anchor at NBC News, narrated by Tom Brokaw.
This is an essay on journalism, coming to you now from NBC News in New York, written by me, a reporter who's been around for a while. That's called a lead. Who, what, when, and where.
John Chancellor talking about his favorite subject. Hello, I'm Tom Brokaw. Journalism was always more than just a job to John. It was a craft, a calling, a civic duty. John loved being a reporter, and he devoted himself to it all of his professional life. He cared about the fundamentals, and his work was distinguished by uncommon clarity and restraint. All that made him a shining example to so many of us who followed. And John's values are embodied to this day in the award that bears his name. He didn't start as an anchorman. John's first love was print, Chicago newspapers, and it shaped his world.
This is John Chancellor on the 23rd floor of the Conrad Hilton.
He got into television when it was new, brought what he learned about journalism with him, and never forgot it.
The number of guards with the 9 Negro students has been considerably diminished.
John's civil rights reporting from Little Rock not only set a standard for television news, it won the respect of his print competitors as well.
I'm in custody.
And remember his famous line as he was escorted off the floor of the 1964 Republican Convention?
This is John Chancellor somewhere in custody.
Well, here's what he said on the air just before that.
I formally say that this is a disgrace, that the press should be allowed and the radio and television should be allowed to do their work at a convention on television.
It was no joke to John. There was a journalistic principle involved. He witnessed and reported on lots of history during his years on the air.
What we saw is impossible to forget and necessary to remember.
John Chancellor was among the best-known journalists in the world, but by choice and by temperament, he always took a back seat to the story itself.
There are many perplexities about this conflict.
He was determined to know and understand and explain the events of the day. To John, that was a public trust, and it was his passion.
There's a little secret about journalism. We would do it for free if that were possible, but they actually pay us to do it.
Since 1995, the John Chancellor Award for Excellence in Journalism has helped keep those values alive by recognizing them in others, some of the most talented, if not always the best-known journalists of our time. I know that John would be impressed with all of them and proud that they have been honored in his name. So, a final word of advice to us all from John himself.
Get it right. Do the job the way it's supposed to be done. There's an old saying in Chicago journalism that applies here. You say your mother loves you, check it out.
Now, please enjoy your lunch, and we will be back shortly with our program honoring Masha Gessen. When we come back, my colleague Nick Lemon is going to help out by hosting the second part of our program. Good afternoon. If you can find your way to your seats, we're about to start with our official program. Unlike most other journalism prizes, this award honors sustained excellence and recognizes reporters who have shown a commitment over time to covering difficult subjects like authoritarian regimes and dictators with courage and integrity. The John Chancellor Award honors journalists who consistently produce the highest quality reporting day in and day out without compromise. Journalists with courage and integrity whose work has had a significant impact for the public good. Masha Gessen is certainly one such reporter. They've informed the nation and the world over 3 decades and across multiple borders about urgent issues that range from war and fragile peace to public health and human rights. Readers have turned to Masha to better understand the steady erosion of civil liberties over the course of Vladimir Putin's regime, the degradation of democratic norms in the Trump era and its aftermath, the state of LGBTQ rights in both countries, and Russia's invasion of Ukraine. A Soviet childhood and 2 decades covering the resurgence of totalitarianism in Russia has given Masha a sixth sense for the manifestations of autocracy and a unique cross-cultural fluency to identify their emergence to Americans. Gessen immigrated to America in 1981, but returned to Russia in 1991 to work as a journalist. While in Moscow, they were often harassed as one of the few openly gay public figures and served on the board of the LGBT rights group Triangle from 1993 through 1998. This year, in reporting that was both prescient and far-ranging, they filed dispatches from Kyiv and Kharkiv just weeks before those cities were devastated by the war. They were in Moscow as Russia's few remaining independent news outlets shut down, and then went to Istanbul, Tbilisi, and other destinations for dissident Russians as bombs fell on Ukraine. Masha also traveled to Bucha this summer to report on Russian war crimes for The New Yorker. They have the courage of their convictions, once losing a job at a Russian publication because they refused to send a reporter to cover a photo op of Vladimir Putin hang gliding. Masha is the author of 12 books as of this morning. No, seriously, I will be like, wait, another one? Including The Future is History, How Totalitarianism Reclaimed Russia, which won the 2017 National Book Award for Nonfiction. The Brothers, The Road to an American Tragedy, a 2015 award-winning account of the Boston Marathon bombers, and The Man Without a Face, The Unlikely Rise of Vladimir Putin, a 2012 portrait of the Russian leader that Foreign Affairs said, quote, shines a piercing light into every dark corner of Putin's story. Their most recent book is Surviving Autocracy. Masha is the recipient of numerous awards, including Guggenheim, Andrew Carnegie, and Neiman Fellowships, the Hitchens Prize, the Overseas Press Club Award for Best Commentary, and an honorary doctorate from the Craig Newmark Graduate School of Journalism. Since 2020, they've served as Distinguished Writer in Residence at Bard College. Congratulations, Masha. And now let me introduce my partner in these proceedings. Columbia University has a long-standing relationship with the Obama Scholars, and we're doing kind of double duty today. So I have to zip off for a commitment with President Obama and the Obama Scholars. And fortunately, our prior dean, Nick Lemon, has graciously agreed to step in for the second half of our proceedings. Nick Lemon is Dean Emeritus here at the Journalism School, where he teaches in our MA program. He served as Dean from 2003 to 2013, and he has been a staff writer at The New Yorker since 1999, another member of the New Yorker family here. Please welcome Nick, and thank you.
Thanks, Jelani. Hi, everybody. Just before we get into the speakers, I want to say a word to remember Ira Lippman, who's not with us, but who is responsible for this award existing. Ira met John Chancellor while he was kind of like what we'd now call a fixer as a high school kid for the National Press Corps that descended on Little Rock, Arkansas, where Ira was from, to cover the Little Rock school crisis. And they kept in touch. I don't know exactly how, but Ira got the idea, well, the next step, and this is a sort of absent friend I'd like to acknowledge. There was a book by David Halberstam called The 50s, and in that book, for a couple pages, is the story of Ira and John Chancellor, which had never been told. And somehow, you all may know how this happened, but that led to Ira getting David Halberstam to help him start this award. So David, who's also no longer with us, was really a guiding spirit of this program, as some of you know well, and we miss him too. But I think they'd both be happy to see today's ceremony and just generally what's happened with the John Chancellor Award. So we're going to have 5 speakers who are friends and colleagues of Masha's to help us mark this special occasion. I'm going to ask all of you, I know some of you, I don't know all of you, but all of you, please come to the stage and sit, and there's a little card in your chair saying where to sit, and then you'll stay up here throughout the rest of the ceremony. So come on up. So, probably not many of you, but a few of you are old enough to remember there was an old TV show called This Is Your Life. This award ceremony is a little bit like that because we bring people up from various phases of the honoree's life to talk about their connection, and it goes serially. Another thing that's distinctive about this ceremony as opposed to other journalism ceremonies is not everybody is inside the walled compound of a news organization who will speak, and that's true every time, which is a nice thing because, our work doesn't just involve us. Okay, so we'll start with somebody who met Masha early in their career. Dr. S. Bryn Austin worked with Masha at The Advocate, the world's leading source of LGBT news and politics in the early 1990s in Los Angeles. Dr. Austin was managing editor at the time and an early admirer of Masha's reporting. Dr. Austin left journalism to pursue a career in public health. She's an award-winning researcher, teacher, and mentor at Harvard's Chan School of Public Health, where she's a professor of social and behavioral sciences, working to advance innovations that can be applied to eating disorders prevention and the study of health inequities that adversely affect sexual and gender minority youth. Welcome, Dr. Austin.
Thank you. It's an honor to be here today and to honor Masha today. To create and to confront, one has to be an outcast. These words, as foreboding as they are concise, are from Masha's award-winning book, Words Will Break Cement, The Passion of Pussy Riot. It's been 30 years since Masha and I last saw each other, so when Columbia reached out to me a few months ago to ask if I would offer this reflection, I figured I'd need to do a little research to help jog my memory. I must offer a preemptive apology if any of the details I share are fuzzy or not quite as things happened. In my research for today, I ran across a few historical gems that I think help tie together some threads from our time working together. In an interview Masha did in 2017 in Out magazine, Masha recounted a story from when they were just 4 years old, which would have been about 1971 when they lived with their family in Moscow. As the story went, Masha's parents held meetings of political activists in their home, and one time a neighbor knocked on the door to ask what was going on. Masha answered the door, at 4 years old, mind you, and proceeded to recount for the neighbor exactly what was happening in the meeting. Much to their parents' consternation, given the risk they faced in 1971 Moscow. The Out magazine interviewer astutely observed, quote, "At age 4, you learned to speak your mind. You didn't have an internal censor," to which Masha agreed. In the same interview, they told another story from age 12 years old, still in Moscow, around 1979. As Masha recounted to the interviewer, quote, "I remember reading Anna Akhmatova's Requiem, an absolutely devastating series of poems she wrote while her son was in jail. I was so taken with Requiem when I was 12 that I made a bunch of copies, bound them, drew covers for them to give them to people. The poems were a kind of journalism. They were from another time, but they exposed a truth that people didn't know." Now, I want you to hold these images of Masha at 4 and Masha at 12, and I'll come back to that in just a moment. Now let's fast forward to 1991. Masha and I both began our careers in LGBT journalism. Our lives crossed paths when I was managing editor at The Advocate and Masha was a freelance writer before coming on staff as an editor there. The Advocate was the leading gay and lesbian news magazine then, a time when there was no recognition of LGBTQIA+. So picture this. It's 1991. The Advocate editorial offices were on the top floor of a 10-story modern building with picture windows looking out over Hollywood Boulevard in the heart of Tinseltown. The historic, spectacularly gaudy Mann's Theater was directly across the street with its 30-foot-high Chinese dragon carved in stone. A movie theater world-renowned not only for hosting the premieres of countless Hollywood classics, but most especially for the movie star handprints indelibly imprinted in the cement sidewalk in front of the theater. Across the street in our editorial offices at The Advocate, not a day or an issue went by without the titillating buzz of Hollywood gossip or an interview with either the latest celebrity to come out of the closet or a movie star ally willing to dish for a spot on our magazine cover. Now try to picture the 4-year-old Masha, the 12-year-old Masha, the 24-year-old Masha in the midst of all this Hollywood excess in shallow puffery. I don't recall the specifics, but I believe the chain of events was that Masha was a freelance writer based in New York, and Masha's incisive international reporting caught our attention at The Advocate. Our editor-in-chief at the time, the late Richard Rillard, loved Hollywood glam as much as he did serious news reporting. And he had a vision for catapulting The Advocate from the margins to the center of news magazines that mattered. I have no doubt that Richard recognized that Masha, as a talented, truth-telling journalist with a sophisticated understanding of world politics, would be a valuable addition to the team. It was not long before Masha made the move to Los Angeles to join the editorial team of The Advocate, as Richard brought the magazine's transformation into focus. Masha wrote several pieces for The Advocate about the struggles of LGBT people in the Soviet Union, the kinds of stories that few other journalists in the US press had the access or the foresight to report. Appearing in the March 12, 1991 issue, Masha's article was titled, "Soviet Gays and Lesbians Fear Crackdown. Repressive Measures Indicate a Newly Restrictive Era." And what was on the cover for this same issue? Hollywood, of course. Roseanne Barr, The Gay Interview. But just 3 months later, certainly in part due to Masha's influence, the magazine struck a different chord. We ran a special issue with the cover story, Global Warning, the New International Activism, featuring reporting from around the world, including Masha's piece, Soviet AIDS Care, Ignorance, Poverty, and Poor Treatment Plague the Medical System. You may sense a theme emerging, which I expect you will continue to hear in each of today's reflections. Masha has always been ahead of the curve in their willingness to look unblinkingly into the depths of despotism and despair, struggle and resistance arising in Europe and globally when few US-based queer journalists were paying much attention. I don't recall how Masha's time at The Advocate came to a close or why they left Los Angeles. But preparing for this reflection, I ran across an article published contemporaneously in Outright International in July 1991 that may help to fill in some gaps. Apparently, in the year before they joined the Advocate editorial team, Masha had the good fortune to meet a group of Russian LGBT activists, and together they decided to organize a conference in Leningrad to strategize about the future of LGBT rights in the Soviet Union. According to the article, which covered summer planning meeting before the Leningrad conference, Masha is described as offering this self-introduction to the fellow advocates assembled in Prague. Quote, "My name is Masha Gessen. I am imprisoned in Los Angeles, where I just moved from New York. I grew up in Moscow, so I had no choice but to work on this conference." Never one to mince words. By year's end, Masha had moved back to Moscow to begin the next phase of their journalism career in the new Russia. I began my reflection with a quote from Masha. "To create and to confront, one has to be an outcast." I suspect this quote may describe Masha's own experience at times, whether during their time in Los Angeles or over the decades since. Masha's corpus clearly exemplifies the first two elements of the quote. They have created and confronted with vigor and courage whenever they saw a truth that needed to be exposed. But for the third element, I think no. My proof? All of us, here, today, right now. Rather than an outcast, Masha has proven themselves to be a citizen of the world. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Our next speaker is Judith Shulevitz, someone I know personally, who Masha credits with giving them their first big national magazine assignment around 1993, when Judith was the editor of Lingua Franca magazine, now of blessed memory. Judith is a longtime journalist and editor, currently a contributing writer for The Atlantic, and the author of The Sabbath World, glimpses of a different order of time. Back at Lingua Franca in the early 90s, Judith brought Masha to the magazine. That first assignment was the beginning of Masha's crossing over to the mainstream press and led to more assignments from the New Republic and Slate, where Judith also worked, including actually both where Judith also worked, but maybe other editors were assigning you things there too, including reporting anonymously from Belgrade during the NATO intervention in Kosovo and the bombing of the Serbian capital. Please welcome Judith Shulevitz.
So Nick was being a little coy. I'm his wife. But this was not nepotism, my being on this panel, because I've known Masha for, well, now we'll be honest, because I was not going to say it, but it's been said, for about 30 years. When I met them, I was the young editor of a little magazine. I feel like, Masha, you might have overstated the national mainstream influence of Lingua Franca. The late lamented Lingua Franca. Lingua Franca was a magazine, I like to think, a lively, entertaining magazine on the unlikely subject of academia and university life. So we were read. But anyway, I was young. They were young. I didn't have the vast wisdom I have now. So I didn't appreciate the magnitude of the talent that walked in the door. I don't remember. I did not walk in the door. I think emailed in the door or called. Anyway, they were a freelance journalist. They pitched. I didn't have the foresight to go out and find Masha. I did know that I was very lucky. Masha made an editor's life much easier. They would always get the story. They would turn it in publishable form or near publishable form. You got to have some purpose in life. So there were I rearranged some things, words, sentences. They had utterly original ideas, not only because they are utterly original, but because they were in Moscow, and no one else writing for Lingua Franca was in Moscow, and also because they were always looking for any excuse to get themselves sent to some dangerous place. And finding one that worked for a magazine about academia could take some imagination. The other day, I dug up a story of Masha's that I've thought about a lot over the past 30 years, and I realized I had not begun to understand how good it was at the time. It is not the work of it is the work of a young writer. It does not read like the work of a young writer. It is fully formed and really quite magnificent. So this is one of these stories that appears to be based on a far-fetched premise in order to qualify as a Lingua Franca story. It goes deep into a quasi-underground, the parallel civil society operated by Albanians, for Albanians, in Pristina, Kosovo, in the early 90s and mid-90s, during one of the most brutal of the many Serbian occupations of the region, when the Serbs cleansed the Kosovan government, medical establishment, and educational system of Albanians. But that shadow society, for all its astonishing scope and unexpected functionality, wasn't what Masha had been assigned to cover. In the immortal words of Tom Lehrer, that was not our department. Masha was supposed to describe how things worked at an underground, quasi-underground university. You might think that under the circumstances, the inner workings of an institution of higher learning would not be exactly the point. You'd be wrong. In Masha's hands, the desperate and dangerous struggle to keep the college going, and the students' equally desperate and dangerous effort to attend it, became a very apt metaphor and a very apt way to convey how the Albanians went about surviving the Serbs. The little details were equally excellent. There were the unheated basement classrooms where, to quote Masha, windows are not a source of light, but a way for the police to see in. There were the translucent eyelids of the beautiful Serbian student on the campus of the official University of Pristina, who tells Masha that Pristina is big, big shit, and Kosovars don't want to go to school because they are stupid. Masha, of course, bagged an interview with Ibrahim Rugova, then the president of the Albanian Republic of Kosovo. Remember, this is for lingua franca. My favorite part of the piece, though, is the lead. In fact, as I went through more of the writing they did for me at Lingua Franca and later at Slate, I realized this kind of lead was already Masha's signature move. And I'm sure their editors and their readers will know what I mean when I read it. This is what they led with. The thing about conflict zones is there is never any toilet paper. A journalist usually resorts to the work of colleagues. That's Masha's irony for you. I'm going to cliche monger here, but it's always struck me as very Soviet era. It's very heavy, it's very light, it's very Death of Stalin. If you know the movie, one of my favorite. Here's another example. Nick already mentioned this, but a few years later, Masha went to Belgrade at the height of the NATO bombing. I think it had already begun, right? When you went. I'm quite sure it had already begun, because I read the first one. And wrote 34 dispatches for us. Masha had to operate under a pseudonym and change locations constantly, lest either the Yugoslav government or a bomb get them. Naturally, this is the sort of thing they sent in. Just before leaving for Belgrade from a certain Eastern European city, I stumbled upon the following news item. In light of the NATO bombings, a Russian publishing house was canceling Monica Lewinsky's publicity tour scheduled for the summer. That was the lead of that particular dispatch. I think it was the second or the third. I could keep reading Masha's leads to you. I could keep reading Masha to you. But now I'm an elder statesman and I know better. And besides, NATO's bombs are no joke, and Masha got serious very quickly, as they know so well how to do, as you all know. But those are the sorts of delightfully ridiculous and ridiculously auspicious beginnings I had the good fortune to be present for. So, thank you, Masha.
Our next speaker is Masha Lippman, who was deputy editor at the Russian political news magazine Itogi, in the late 1990s in Moscow, when she recruited Masha Gessen to join the staff. Itogi was modeled on Newsweek magazine. By then, Gessen had moved to Moscow and was freelancing. While a native Russian speaker, this was their first job writing and reporting in the Russian language. Lippman edited Gessen's stories, and Masha Gessen credits Masha Lippman with being one of the best editors they've ever had, tied with Judith, I'm sure. In addition to editing Russian weekly news magazines from 1995 to 2003, Masha Lippman has written extensively on Vladimir Putin and the Russian media and is a regular contributor to The New Yorker and The Washington Post. Today, she is editor of Russia.Post, an experimental expert journalism platform that seeks to lift the new Iron Curtain and to shed light on developments inside Russia. Please welcome Masha Lippman.
Masha, congratulations. Very honored to be part of this wonderful event. I'm going to take you to a Russia without Putin, yet not a dreamland of the future, but the Russia of the 1990s. These days, the 1990s are broadly seen in Russia as the time of predatory oligarchs and national humiliation. But at least some remember it as the time of incredible opportunity and improbable freedom from the government control. New privately owned publications were emerging, fully free of the government interference, relying on their audience and the advertising revenues, not on state funding. One such publication was Itogi, or summing up, Russia's first news magazine. I was Itogi's co-founder and deputy editor. Masha Gessen was a member of our team of reporters. I'm talking about very young Masha Gessen, before they gained broad international fame, before they became a parent, and before the internet. I will get to the internet a bit later. Almost instantly, Masha became my favorite author, well, maybe one of my favorite authors, because Masha was an excellent reporter, because Masha was smart and funny and had a great smile and a great sense of irony, something that has always been highly valued in the Russian intellectual circles. Masha was a fast speaker, I guess still is, and even more importantly, from an editor's perspective, a fast writer, and an almost impeccable one. And even though I'm a demanding editor, I soon realized that there was not much for me to edit in her texts. Masha's primary talent in those days was that of a reporter, and many of her stories are still very vivid in my memory. A report about prospecting gold in the Russian Far East, and part of the same reporting trip, a story about the remains of Stalin's labor camps in that region. A report from former Yugoslavia on the verge of war, and how a country is drifting into a war before the actual military operations begin. A story about racism in Moscow, and the plight of black African students who faced two enemies, the skinheads and the police. About Chechens in Moscow after the First Chechen War. They couldn't return to Chechnya and were a target of inescapable police brutality in the Russian capital. About Russian prostitutes in the north of Norway. About the gigantic immigration wave of the 1990s and the brain drain. It was obvious that Masha's talent was virtually unlimited. They could do any story and do it perfectly. At some point, we were discussing in the newsroom that we wanted to have a profile of George Soros, but it was not immediately clear who could accomplish such an ambitious project. I remember Masha's somewhat condescending smile as they said, "Shall I do it for you?" Suggesting, as it were, that it was easy, nothing to speak about. I mentioned that all of this was before the internet. Of course, the internet already existed, but few had everyday experience with it. We decided we needed to do a front-page story to explain to our readers just what the internet was and what it could do. And of course, it was Masha's story. Who else would do it? The cover line was a play on words. The net in the internet, of course, means no in Russian. So the cover line read as internet, inter da, inter может быть. Internet no, inter yes, inter maybe. Few could fathom at the time the true potential of the internet. And the same is true of Masha Gessen. At Itogi magazine, we all saw how talented Masha was, but we couldn't fathom at the time either the scope of their future achievement or their future fame. Congratulations again.
Okay, now I'm going to introduce our next speaker, David Remnick. David has been the editor of The New Yorker since 1998 and a staff writer there since 1992. To our Russia-centric interest at this lunch, in 1988, he started a 4-year tenure as the Washington Post's Moscow correspondent, an experience that formed the basis of his 1993 book on the former Soviet Union, Lenin's Tomb, The Last Days of the Soviet Empire. In 1994, Lenin's Tomb received both the Pulitzer Prize for nonfiction and a George Polk Award for excellence in journalism. And of course, David has been, as we say in universities, my colleague, and as we say in newsrooms, my boss at The New Yorker for 23 and a half years. David and Masha have known each other since sometime in the early 90s when David was living in Moscow. Please welcome David.
So at long last comes my opportunity to complain to Columbia University. First dean of the journalism school they snatched from the New Yorker was Nick Lemon. That was funny. Okay, fine. Then they repeat the joke, Steve Call, the next year, and then Jelani Cobb. And I think that the entire staff of the New Yorker, sooner or later, is going to get their crack at the Columbia School of Journalism. and I resent it deeply, and it's a problem in terms of management. The second thing I want to say is about Masha Gessen. I'm slightly terrified of Masha Gessen. What does this mean? Deep in any editor's heart, if he or she is not lying to oneself, is that once you have someone on your staff who is of rare talent, the best thing to do is say yes and get the hell out of the way. And so it is out in the greater world, it is thought that I know something about Russia. It's a joke. Compared to Masha Gessen and now Josh Yaffa and Masha Lippman, whom we've published with great pleasure, and now Luke Mogelson, who's been running around in Kiev, I know absolutely nothing. So my best strategy with Masha is to say yes, to listen, and get out of the way, which I try to do as much as possible. And I should say this too. Masha Gessen is a hero. Masha Gessen is compared every once in a while as every war correspondent and any correspondent with any moral bearing to George Orwell. And this has become a kind of tiresome cliche over time, and so-and-so is like Orwell and so on. In this case, it is absolutely true. And it's true because Masha Gessen is not only physically courageous, as Orwell was, but Masha Gessen also puts himself in the way of subjects who live difficult lives, who live the lives of underdogs, who are suffering, and Masha is there the next day and the next day and the next day, and has an incredible sense of moral judgment and clarity. And so there, I think the comparison is apt and true. The first time I ever encountered Masha was, of course, in Moscow more than 30 years ago. Mikhail Gorbachev was still the general secretary of the Communist Party. And while his policies of glasnost and perestroika had opened many doors of examination and study and publication and protest, one area that seemed utterly underground still, at least to my eye as a reporter, was the entire subject of gay rights, of homosexuality. This was not something that was discussed or published to any great extent, even in the most liberal publications. And so as an enterprising correspondent for the Washington Post, I had heard talk that in a couple of bars around the Bolshoi Theater in downtown Moscow, there was a bit of a scene. So I took my notebook out and started heading there, and there was also a rumor that there might be a demonstration even, a gay rights demonstration. And having followed the first rule, the most important rule of journalism, which is to show up, I encountered this demonstration. And leading the demonstration was Masha Gessen, slight, fierce, intent, and the most badass hairdo I have ever seen in my life. A fantastic mohawk. And this began what really was an important moment, I think, in Russian politics, the outward LGBTQ movement, which of course has run into nothing but horrific, violent, state-sponsored opposition and even violence from the Kremlin. And so that was my first encounter with Masha. The second encounter, of course, was in the offices here and there, not often, but sometimes, at Itogi, which was run by Masha Lippman and Seryozha Parkhomenko, and I started reading them. And these were dispatches of it was something different. We'd seen a lot of journalism, new journalism in Moscow during the perestroika era, that were breaking taboos, that were saying the unsaid. This was repertorial journalism of a higher order than even anything I'd seen during the glasnost and perestroika era. It was deeply and ferociously reported, and again, these were texts that reminded one of dispatches and the text of something like Orwell's coverage of the Civil War in Spain. Their reporting from Moscow to Grozny was, like its author, exacting, passionate, fierce, and I say this with admiration beyond measure. It was the work and is the work of the ultimate cosmopolitan, somebody who is absolutely fluent not only in 2 languages but in 2 cultures, and so was able to speak to me whether they were writing in English or Russian, which is something rare. So now it's our turn to honor Masha Gessen. Masha's not being honored for the first time, but this is something special in my mind. No one has written with more penetration from both inside and from a distance about the rise of authoritarianism in Russia, and in no small way in our own politics. Masha's writing on the Russian intelligentsia, on a group like Pussy Riot, on the Russian media, Kremlin politics, the history and tragedy of Jewish life in Russia, on Putin himself, and now with boundless rigor, the war in Ukraine. There is nobody like Masha Gessen. It's writing that's essential and strong and uncompromising in its ability and willingness to confront the truth. Traditionally, at the tables of the Russian intelligentsia, there comes a moment to combine the foggy pleasures of vodka with a clear sense of political possibilities. And a glass is raised, and we toast in the following way: to the success of our hopeless mission. I would only add that I also toast to you, Masha, in particular, and our gratitude to your continuing mission as a writer in this country and your work parochially for The New Yorker. Thank you so much.
Now, as I mentioned earlier, it's the tradition of this award to hear from someone with a different perspective on our honoree. Please welcome Lika Kramer, who comes to us from Russia via Tbilisi. Lika and her husband were recently one of the subjects of Masha's New Yorker story on Russians fleeing Putin's wartime crackdown. She has gone from being a child star to a Russian news presenter, at one point appearing on the Russian version of Dancing with the Stars, to working behind the scenes with Masha at a short-lived magazine called Snob, and then at Radio Free Europe. According to Masha, Lika is somebody who can organize anything and get absolutely anything done, including launching a podcast company called Libo, where she is the CEO. Please welcome Lika Kramer.
Congratulations, Masha, and thank you for having me. On July the 3rd of 2009, I was sitting across from Masha in an editorial office of Snob magazine. Snob magazine could be best described as an attempt by Russian journalists to recreate New Yorker. Masha was the editor-in-chief of Snob magazine and my first ever editor-in-chief. Everything I know about journalism, about media management, about how the editorial process works, I know from Masha. And now I run a successful podcast company, which I founded, and I first learned about podcasts 12 years ago from Masha. And so on July 3rd, 2009, we were in the middle of a meeting, and I was sitting across from Masha, and we were discussing some publication plan. However, I was feeling a bit distracted because I was quite pregnant, and my belly kept bothering me. And Masha suggested that perhaps I was in labor. Although certainly I was not. Masha kept insisting and offering to take me to the hospital. And I didn't like arguing with Masha. To be perfectly honest, I was a bit scared of them. I was even a bit scared of talking to them directly since they struck me with quite categorical. So I usually did it with some colleagues. But at that moment, I was quite certain I was right and that Masha was just exaggerating as per usual. Plus, we had a lot on our agenda. I say as per usual because then I felt that Masha was prone to hyperbole in their interactions, in their writing, that they could be too strict and too radical. But they were also an authority, a source of knowledge, new ideas, and the center of a special microcosm for 24 of us. Together we worked, we formed friendships, we took trips to the dacha, and gave birth from time to time. This close-knit circle of 24 people is something we were able to preserve to this day. In the year 2000, when Putin came to power, Masha was one of the few who consistently wrote about the danger of what may come. People around me thought that Masha was exaggerating and over-dramatizing. Russia still had independent media. Mayors and governors were still being elected rather than appointed. American foundations were not yet deemed unlawful, and Russia orphans with disabilities were still able to get adopted by foreign citizens. People like Masha, political activists, LGBTQ pioneers, journalists talking about lustration, were considered outcasts. This was one of the main inventions of the Putin regime, indoctrinating that the political and the personal are not connected. The political is this gobbledygook, the language of activist, altruist people who do not care about comfort, who do not have any personal needs, who don't value their everyday private lives. Activists were respected, of course, but more often than not talked about with irony. And we journalists, liberals, people with regular jobs and higher education, were to view reality through a critical lens, to be fair and balanced, exhibiting wise restraint, to avoid exaggeration and radical ideas. Because these lives were leading had many hallmarks of the personal, professional ambition, comfort, families, children, we felt certain that it would matter more than this Putin guy. All we had to do was publish like they do in New Yorker, work a lot, read our children good books, set up bicycle paths in Moscow, and not pay too much attention to the crazy laws being enacted by our government. Because this couldn't possibly last. We couldn't possibly imagine that this dichotomy of the personal and the political was an illusion promoted by autocracy in order to keep the masses from interfering in its business. In June 11th, 2013, Masha went out to protest the newly proposed Russian anti-gay law prohibiting LGBT propaganda. At this protest, an Orthodox activist beat Masha up. That was the same activist who just the day before had offered to adopt Masha's children because, in his mind, a lesbian couple couldn't possibly manage raising children. And the protest looked more or less like this. In the center of Moscow, occupying a small patch of land, stood a group of few dozen people, Masha amongst them. And few Orthodox activists surrounded the group and began pelting them with condoms filled with fecal matter. A few dozen more protesters stood nearby across the street, and more still were following via social media and the news. And I was one of those people. We, of course, were supportive of the protesting LGBT activists, but we simply couldn't believe that this proposed legislation would be signed into law, and so our support stopped short of putting ourselves in the way of poop-filled condom bombs. 2 hours later, after meeting where my belly was bothering me, I gave birth to my daughter Marusia. She's 13 years old now. I can't say that I birthed Marusia exclusively thanks to Masha, but solely thanks to Masha, I not birth her in a meeting room or in a taxi cab. When Marusia was 4, Masha left Russia for good because the anti-gay law was unanimously approved by our government, meaning that every single same-sex couple raising a family was faced with a very real threat of their children being taken away from them by authorities. Masha released a video statement about it wearing a pink triangle, just like the one I'm wearing now. Masha said that the Nazis made gay people wear these pink triangle patches in concentration camps, making a very bold parallel between the two regimes. I didn't really believe in this parallel. And even when Russia annexed Crimea, many of us still believed that there was a place in Russia for our personal lives, that we could stay away from politics. For an entire 8 years, we believed that Masha was exaggerating. My husband and I left Russia with our children 8 years later than Masha did, after Russia began the bombing of Kiev. Of the 24 close friends and colleagues of Masha, those who then sat at the same table with us on an editorial board, not a single one has remained in Russia. I no longer believe that journalists need to stay away from activism. I no longer see a difference between the personal and the political. And because I'm no longer fearful of radical expression, I'd like to say this to you. I'm guilty. I'm guilty because I didn't put on this pink triangle earlier. Perhaps had I done it then, had we all stood by your side under those poop-filled bombs, million Ukrainian lives would not have been ruined today with the real ones. Thank you.
Now I'd like to ask 2 of Ira Lippman's 3 sons, Gus and Josh, to come up and join me on stage. Somewhere in here. Right. This is for you. Okay. And I need help finding the actual John Chancellor Award, I think.
I think this is it.
Oh, that's it. Okay, we got it. Okay. When Ira was with us, he would read remarks every year. So I'm going to read some of his remarks in his memory. Through his reporting, John Chancellor dispelled lies and ignorance. For the first time, the new age of television journalism enabled the world to see the ugliness of racial hatred. And the result was a great advance for the cause of civil rights. That's why journalism is so important today and will be in the future. It is our first line of defense against those who would subject the world to lies and ignorance. By spreading light and truth, journalists have the power and influence to make the world a better place to live in, not just for a few, but for millions or even billions. When he agreed to permit us to establish the John Chancellor Award for Excellence in Journalism, he envisioned rewarding the kind of journalism that would say to successive generations, this is the sort of work to which we should dedicate our lives. And then, this isn't in my script, but Ira would always say, as you remember, John Chancellor was my hero. So I'll say he was Ira's hero. Now on to Masha. Masha's work meets that test proposed by Ira. They have championed the principles that make society more hospitable to both tolerance and truth. Masha, we honor the memory of John Chancellor by honoring your work. You have our admiration and gratitude for your contributions to journalism and to society. Please come to the stage. Masha, in tribute to the life work of John Chancellor, we're really pleased to present you with the John Chancellor Medal for Excellence in Journalism and a check for $25,000. A few words from Masha.
Thank you. I'm actually speechless. I've learned a few things today, including that This Is Your Life was a television show, not just a turn of phrase. This keeps happening to me. Thank you. I moved beyond measure, and I can't believe I had the audacity to ask people and come and, as instructed, to ask people to come and talk about me, including one person I haven't seen in more than 30 years. Thank you, Bryn. That was extraordinary. Thank you. I want to just say a couple of things. That there were several people who were very important in my life and my formation as a journalist who are dead today, who died of AIDS, and I want to mention them. Gary Chaffetz was a publisher in Massachusetts who gave me my first job. He, for some reason, decided that a 21-year-old could edit a magazine, and I did for a couple of years and learned on the job. And then Richard Willard, who died in 1996, he invited me to The Advocate and taught me to be an editor. And I remember a time when I had assigned a story on Tom Duane, who was the first HIV positive candidate for public office. And the story had come in, I had edited it, it was already on the boards, so it was hanging on the wall, typeset. And Richard read it on the boards and then came into my office, closed the door, and said, okay, I read the story, it's fine, but it's not interesting. There are questions that occur to people. There's like this obvious thing. People really want to know what it's like for an HIV positive man to be running for office. Like all the natural questions that the writer was too polite to try to ask and answer. Like the curiosity should be satisfied in this piece. That's really the only journalism instruction I've ever received, and it's enough. It's like from that moment on, I had license to go to weird places and talk to people and try to satisfy my curiosities. And that's the fact that I get paid for it is ridiculous. What's most striking, though, is that I've been so lucky that I keep being able to do it. A lot of journalists say this when we get to talk about our work, but I experience it very literally. Most of my former colleagues can't work. They can't work in the media in Russia. Many of them change professions. They do great things. They don't get to do this thing I love so much. Many of them have had to leave the country and try to practice journalism from exile. Their sites are blocked. Their publications have been declared foreign agents. They have personally been declared foreign agents. And I get to write. I get to write, and I get to have my stuff read by one of the greatest audiences in the world, which is the audience of The New Yorker. Thank you, David. And the fact that I also get an award for it is just absurd. Thank you. It's a huge, huge honor and also embarrassing. Thank you.
Don't go anywhere because we have to post for a picture. Okay. Thanks, everybody. Congratulations, and thanks for everything you do, Masha. And thanks to all of you for coming. See you next year. Everyone who's up on the stage, you have to stay here for a minute to have our picture taken, okay? Otherwise, it's been a great lunch.